Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. What we're going to talk about today is which age class of whitetail deer, whitetail bucks in general, are hardest to harvest. I think that there is probably, if you were to ask, let's just say a panel of 100 hunters, right? I would be willing to bet that 80 to 90% of those hunters would answer that question by saying, just initially saying, the oldest buck in the neighborhood is the hardest buck to kill. So there are some truth to that, but the average is not, that's not the gospel, right? That's not the hard, solid, concrete answer. What I find, guys, is this: with the experience that I have around the country, not only hunting, but guiding, consulting, building properties, what I find is this. I find that probably is going to shock you that it's just the complete opposite. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about just that today. So you always hear, I think, a lot of the attention when you're the majority of the deer that are focused on, if you kind of took the whole country as a whole, and the law of averages, right? Because there's part of the country, guys, a lot of part of the countries that just don't consistently hold 5.5, 6.5 and year old and older bucks. And the reason for that is high pressure, right? Long gun seasons, high pressure, maybe even throw the, mortality rates into that as far as predators, harsh winter conditions. The farther you get north, there's just a lot of parts of the country with a lot of hunters, let's say, that brings that average back down to the most mature deer in your area could potentially be a 3.5 or 4.5 year old buck. So with that being said, the question is, which age class is hardest, right? This right here, guys, is, to me, is probably one of the harder age classes to hunt. So when I say that, guys, the reason I say that is this: when you have a buck that is in its prime, right? So the way I use that is your 1.5 year old bucks, your 2.5 year old bucks are kind of your elementary, your 1.5 year old bucks are elementary, right? School kids, right? They're really reliant on a lot of situations, a lot of the property, a lot of the food, stuff like that. A 2-year-old buck jumps into what we would refer to probably as that middle school buck, right? That middle school, that pre-teen age, And what happens is they start feeling their oats a little bit, right? They start being able to research and wandering. And if you relate that to your pre-teen, sometimes they can be a handful, right? The 3.5 and 4.5 year old bucks, what I find, guys, they are, depending on where you're at in the country, they could be your high school kids or your high school condition. They could be maybe early college kind of type, right? If we're relating that to humans. And the reason I say that, guys, they're kind of in the prime of their life. So what happens is they start searching, right? They go from their home area where they know great, and they start roaming because their body allows them to really start putting the miles on. So to me, a lot of the harder deer to harvest are your 3.5 and 4.5 year old deer on average, because they're covering such a large area, right? So this is where things start getting, where are you at in the country? So if you are targeting those deer, because let's just face it, right? A lot of the country, 3.5 and 4.5 year old deer are the most mature. What happens is, if your property isn't set up to hold those deer longer during daylight hours, or make it so they frequent your property more than all the other properties in the area, what happens is those bucks have the prime of their life, the best body condition, and they start roaming. So you might see, you farther you go north in the whitetails range, I see a lot of this. And the reason for that is, guys, or this could happen in the South. I see this a lot in like South Carolina, parts of Alabama, stuff like that. And the reason for that is they cover such a large area. So you're waiting for those most mature deer to return to you. Sometimes they return, sometimes they don't, right? Because it's not enough correct habitat. Maybe it's just a law of averages that you don't own enough property, right, to control their mentality. But the other side of it is, I see a lot of folks that own some, good amount of property, maybe 40, 80s, 100s, 120, something like that, which is plenty of ground, but the habitat isn't correct. So they dissect your property in a matter of minutes and they're off to the neighbors. The problem with that is this: they may never return. And because they're covering so much ground, they're going to get themselves in trouble at some point. So yes, on a law of averages, I would say that the 3.5 and 4.5-year-old bucks are probably the hardest deer to kill because of those two situations. So where you don't see it, and the reason I left 2.5-year-olds out here, guys, is 2.5-year-old deer are probably the most vulnerable bucks. So we're just going to put that into here. 2.5-year-old deer are the probably the easiest deer, in my opinion, to harvest on an average across the country. And the reason for that is, guys, they're just starting to want to figure their home range out, right? And they're doing a lot of traveling, but they don't have the experience yet of these 3.5 or 4.5-year-old deer, and they get themselves in trouble because there's a lot of volume. I find that there's a lot of volume of bucks that maybe you're in an area, maybe it's an APR, maybe it's a 1 buck state. A lot of that ties into that, but you have a volume of 2.5-year-old deer. Let's just use these two states. Michigan and Wisconsin are notorious for that. I highly believe that that's the problem with having a long gun season with so many hunters, is because when these bucks are most vulnerable at 2.5 years old, those deer are what's getting harvested the most. So I hope that one makes sense. What happens is, it's hard to advance age class when you're hunting the deer. A lot of folks are hunting or being successful on, let's just say that, on the deer that are the easiest to hunt. It's just law of averages, right? Numbers don't lie. So that's what happens in most of those states. So, am I happy for you? Absolutely. If that's the buck of choice, I'm not saying, I'm not saying don't shoot 2.5-year-olds. I'm just saying that's why that happens, right? If that's maybe it's the oldest buck in your community, but most cases are the reason that those deer get harvested is because they're kind of the most immature, not the youngest deer, but they're the ones that just haven't put it together yet, and there's a volume of those, right? So let's go to the next one here, guys. The two deer age class, the two buck age classes that I find that are the easiest to hunt, that wouldn't be the hardest to hunt, right, are the 1.5-year-old and the 5.5-year-old age classes. And the reason I say that is this: these 1.5-year-old bucks usually get dispersed. Now, there's a couple areas in the country that this doesn't happen a lot, but a lot of your 1.5-year-old bucks, guys, are bucks that were actually born, buck fawns that were actually born not on your property, not in your community. And to be honest with you, depending on your region, depending on the habitat, they could disperse 5-10 miles. Some research shows 20 miles, right? So that's another video we've got coming up here, guys. But you're really not, those 1.5-year-old bucks weren't born, let's say, on your property. Does it happen? Absolutely. I've got a couple here that I know exactly who they are because of the way the rack looks, right? And they've been here all the time. But the reason that the good Lord designed it that way is because the does stay very local, and if they stayed, you're going to get a lot of inbreeding. So they actually are wired to disperse. So kind of a neat feature of a whitetail. What that makes them, guys, is it makes them very vulnerable to that new area because they know the area. They don't have the urge to quite leave, and they're kind of a homebody yet, right? 2.5-year-old, they start dispersing more, like we talked. The 5.5-year-old age class, guys, is their mind kind of starts relating back to that home core area where that 1.5-year-old buck was real comfortable. this 5.5-year-old buck starts thinking about, hey, I don't want to breed as many does, so I don't have to travel as much ground miles, and my core becomes more important to them, right? The sad part of that is, guys, is a lot of folks think this age class right here is the hardest to hunt because we're blowing those deer out, because they don't put up with much of a wrongdoing in their core, and they're gone. They go somewhere else where there's no one bumping them out. I really believe that's why a lot of folks think that age class bucks are the hardest to hunt, just for that reason, right? They're so smart, they've learned so much by then, and if you bump them, you may make them the hardest deer to hunt. But in general, guys, I think when that buck becomes 5.5 years old, contrary to a lot of belief, that buck starts making his way into very, very vulnerable, because he starts knowing that core. If you're not bumping him out, food starts becoming key. And the older they get, like a lot of us, probably males that are watching this, right, the food, the refrigerator is going to get you in trouble. And that's what starts happening. So they're very vulnerable early season and late season when they are so reliant on these food sources. So is it the 5.5-year-old buck? No. This one right here, guys, is, to me, and beyond, is probably the number one easiest deer to harvest, is a buck that's 6.5 years or older. If you take the time, you understand the ins and outs of your property, you don't overpressure it, and you let him play his cards, that you have 5.5 years, let's say, of information, 5.5 years of information that got him to that point. He's very smart. He's not going to put up with a lot. So what happens, guys, I start dialing in, I always recommend this, is your hunts, the older a buck gets, the less you should hunt him. Less you should have to hunt him, right? And the reason for that is he's not going to give you many chances to screw up. So when you go in to hunt a deer like this, you have to align, the stars all have to align. You have to wait till that time is perfect. That doesn't mean hunting mornings in September. That doesn't mean hunting mornings in early October. That means waiting or the pre-rut. Waiting until all of that connects and he starts making major mistakes. Then go in and get the job done. Because guys, let's be honest, this buck right here, the more that you hunt him, every time that you hunt him, your odds actually go down instead of going up, that you would be maybe hunting a 4.5 or 5.5-year-old buck. So take that into consideration on some strategies that you're looking at and going to be tuning in on this habitat season, and also the remainder of this hunting season. This one right here, guys, is not, like I said, if you asked 100 people, most people would tell you that this 5.5, 6.5-year-old deer is the hardest deer to hunt, and that's not the truth. These two deer right here are the hardest deer to hunt, is because they're traveling such a large amount of area. Now, on law of averages, right? This buck right here, these two bucks right here, 5.5, 6.5 years and older, can help you not have to hunt as many days, because they have laid a blueprint, right? That's where Weather Underground and all this stuff you hear me preach about comes into play, is because I would rather hunt these two age classes because of the way that they're built, the way that they're actually getting wore out. They're more food reliant. It doesn't make you, it kind of keeps you from getting yourself into trouble. Start looking back. Is that buck, what you'll find is this, guys, is what I find is these bucks here are bucks that they're wired, right? They're just wired that way. You might get some bucks that are extremely travelers from year 1 to year 6.5. Has lots to do with your community, has a lot to do with your habitat. But what you'll find in most cases is these 5.5, 6-year-old bucks that a lot of us are trying to target, right? What happens is you're able to look back at that playbook that they've put in place, set in place, and pretty much handed you over the years. what you'll find, guys, is those bucks have always had those traits, and they're always telling us what that is, right? If it's a buck that is just the bully of the woods and doesn't want anybody else in his community, and he's a dominant buck from the time he's 4.5, 3.5, 4.5-year-old on, well, maybe you got to implement some heavier handed strategies to get that job done during the rut, let's say, or something like that, pre-rut or the rut. Most cases are, guys, is the bucks that you'll find that these 6.5-year-old, 5.5-year-old, 6.5-year-old bucks that you're targeting may be bucks that showed themselves more in the early season. Then they dispersed to a property maybe that wasn't the best habitat, but just didn't have enough pressure. Then they came back to your property because hopefully you're the property in the area that has some food left, and they're so reliant on that food source, right? So the what that does, guys, to me is it helps answer the question to folks and really give you a mindset on, okay, most folks think the older a buck gets, the longer I have to spend in the woods, the more time I have to be there, the more tricky I have to be, the more habitat improvements, the more. And it's actually just completely the opposite, right? I've had been pretty fortunate and blessed to have a lot of successful clients take this advice and tune themselves back on these older age class bucks. Lord willing that they make it through the Orange Armies, and I'm part of the Orange Army too, right? But I mean, making it through that, and when they come back to your area or they start settling in, you have enough fuel left in the tank to hunt these deer. Because sadly, guys, what happens is when they're most vulnerable, like the late season, for example, we're so burnt out. We've traveled all over the country. Maybe we've hunted 3-4 different states. Your home state, your farm's burnt out because you just are caught up in believing that more is better, and you're probably not going to have the opportunity, the easier opportunity that you could have had on these 6.5-year-old bucks. For that reason, it's because you blew the alarm. You let them know that you're there. They're going to be somewhere where there's not a lot of pressure involved. So I just really like to take each year to try to help some folks, and this is something that I talk to my clients about a lot throughout this habitat season around the country, is let that farm, let that deer, let that target buck show his cards. And here is the sealer of the whole deal, guys. Sealer of the whole deal. If these 5.5, 6.5-year-old bucks are actually doing this, and they're the easiest ones in the area to hunt, the older they get, what this does is I find that it helps my clients tremendously, knowing that it's that marathon, not a sprint approach, right? So all of a sudden, the next year, you've got a buck that maybe is a 4.5-year-old going into a 5.5-year-old, and all of a sudden, my clients are calling and saying, hey, last year I killed a 5.5-year-old, this year I killed a 5.5-year-old. 3 seasons in a row, they've killed 6.5, 5.5, 4.5-year-old bucks, the oldest buck in their neighborhood, and they hunted less. It happens a lot, guys. So this year, for example, I'm one of those hunters that I had a 4.5-year-old buck, and you've seen a video of this, but I had a buck move into the area I wasn't really familiar with. He got bumped from somewhere else. I think I had one velvet picture of him that I could relate that it was him, and I seen a buck with my gun, a 4.5-year-old deer. Didn't know exactly who he was, thought he was a 10-point, ended up deciding to shoot the buck, and when I got down to him, I realized that it was that deer. So that deer had been everywhere, right? So he was one of those ones that was in his prime. There's probably somebody 2 or 3 miles from here that was saying, man, I wish I would have, I wish that deer would come back. They might be waiting for him to come back now, not knowing that he's gone, because they're traveling so much. He just happened to be on my farm that day. Now, looking back at that, it wasn't the oldest buck in the neighborhood, right? I've got 2 or 3 bucks that made it through. 5.5-year-old, a couple are going to be 6.5-year-old, believe it or not, next year. And so it just wasn't the oldest buck in the neighborhood. So take that into consideration, guys, going into next year, going into the habitat season. and really start wrapping your mind around these deer that most people think are hardest to hunt are not the hardest to hunt. It's completely the opposite, right? The older a buck gets, the easier he should become if you're allowing your property to have that opportunity, and you're allowing yourself to have that opportunity and to be something left in the tank. Less hunting is better when it comes to mature bucks. Thanks, guys.